Hello, so as requested by one of my friends, I'm going to make a revision video on utilitarianism, so I hope this is good for your bath. I'll just choke on the words, right. Okay, so utilitarianism. The principle of utility is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarianism's, you can't really categorise it as one theory, it's more like there's like multiple different versions of the same theory because there's like so much diversity within the details of the theory and the different people who had an approach to utilitarianism. So Jeremy Bentham was the founder of utilitarianism, and he was a 19th or 18th century atheist. He wanted to be the most benevolent man who ever existed, or something like that. So I guess a little bit narcissistic, perhaps. He was quite a shy man, but he was extremely intelligent. He reformed prison systems, and he was the founder of the postal system that we have, I think, in the UK. I assume in the UK anyway. I don't know if it's more universal than that. Yeah, I've got notes in front of me just in case I need to look at them, which probably will. Okay, so I'll start off with Bentham's utilitarianism, seeing as though he was the founder. Okay, so Bentham derived the Hedonic Calculus, or created the Hedonic Calculus, as a means of measuring pleasure, and he basically believed that pleasure is that greater amounts of pleasure equals greater amounts of morality, almost, because utilitarianism is essentially an ethical theory. It's the greatest happiness for the greatest number, so whatever makes the most people happy is the most moral thing to do. Okay, so what was I just saying? Okay, yeah, Bentham, he derived the Hedonic Calculus, and you might be surprised to hear that he was a hedonist, which means that he put a lot of emphasis on pleasure, like pleasure being the ultimate goal, I guess. So the Hedonic Calculus was constructed of an acronym that we do, which is PRICED. So it starts off with the purity of the pleasure, the richness of the pleasure, the remoteness of the pleasure, the intensity of the pleasure, the certainty of the pleasure, the extent of the pleasure, and the duration of the pleasure. So all of these different things have to be taken into account when making a moral decision, or making a decision to do pretty much anything. I guess you can criticise that straight away and say, well, that's going to take a pretty long time to go through this hedonic calculus, and every time you want to do something. But I guess it can be good because it shows quantitative differences between pleasure, and that may be subjective, but it's your own judgment. So yeah. But another criticism of it is that he seems to focus on the quantity of the pleasure. So obviously, if you're just focusing on the quantity of the pleasure, you can justify things like gang rape, because surely, like, assuming it's 5 people raping one person, that's the pleasure of 5 at the sacrifice of sacrificing one person, so causing one person to suffer. And under Bentham's utilitarianism, there's nothing to say that isn't allowed. What else have we got? Bentham was a humanist. He took a humanist approach, and this is partially linked to him also being an atheist, because he didn't put faith in God necessarily, like studying humans and I guess put people at the centre of ethics. Okay, he didn't believe that there was any objective moral code, and this also links to him being an atheist. He believed that ethics was almost like a social construct, and you can see that it's based on pleasure. Okay, so utilitarianism. I've jumped a little bit here, but utilitarianism is teleological and relativist. Now, teleological means that it focuses on the consequences of an action and not the action and motive, so we can say it's not very much like Kantian ethics. And it's relativist, which means you've got to take each situation differently. You can't have an absolute moral rule or an objective moral code, like I've said a minute ago. You have to analyse each situation separately because you're probably going to derive a different moral conclusion from each one. Okay, Bentham's Mill described Bentham's philosophy. That's John Stuart Mill, who I've talked about before. Described Bentham's approach to utilitarianism as pig philosophy because he put so much emphasis on pleasure and I guess you can associate pleasure with a pig. A pig might like to sit around doing the things which gives it the most pleasure, but for a person perhaps we have to make some sacrifices, suffer in the moment so that we can perhaps feel happier in the long run. And that's Mill's take on utilitarianism. He perceived the quality of the pleasure to be higher than the quantity of the pleasure, and this seems to make sense, because there do seem to be some pleasures which are higher than others or which are more important than others, and they may not necessarily be the most enjoying thing at the time. So examples of this could be making music, doing your homework, like all of... So I think of any more examples. I haven't wrote any down on here, I don't think. I guess going to work, just taking responsibility for certain things. All of these may be they're higher than perhaps eating chocolate, drinking alcohol. Now, all of these things may give you instant pleasure in the moment, but it's not a pleasure that's going to extend, I guess, forward into the future and give you a more long-term happiness. So Mill puts a lot of emphasis on that. He had a quote, and I'm going to struggle to say this because it's a bit of a tongue twister, but it's better to be a fool satisfied than a pig dissatisfied. It's better to be a human... I think I've already done it wrong. It's better to be a fool satisfied, a fool dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. I got it. And that's basically saying that that the intellectual pleasures are higher than pleasures of the mind. I mean, pleasures of the body. So Mill, he like almost creates a hierarchy of pleasures, and intellectual pleasures are at the top of that hierarchy, and bodily pleasures are lower down. But we can criticise this because we can't partake in those higher pleasures if we don't first partake in some of the bodily pleasures. For example, we have to eat. That's just something that's essential to survival. So it's not that it's... I think Mill should have specified that it's not that it's absolutist in every single circumstance that intellectual pleasures are higher than bodily pleasures, because that's not the case. If you don't eat, then you're not going to be able to live to be able to enjoy the higher pleasures of all the intellectual pleasures. And Mill might have specified that, but not that I know of from what I've studied of him. Okay. Mill put emphasis on universalizability, and if I remember correctly, this is the idea that happiness is the only ultimate end goal, or the only universal end goal. The only reason people do things is to be happy. Whereas Mill, he treats pleasure as an end in itself almost, or a means. Yeah. So Mill treats pleasure as a means to an end. So you should always use happiness as your main end and pleasure as a means to get there. So it's like you've obviously got to consider the end, which might be which you have to, I guess, take responsibility for and weigh up and say, okay, well, is this going to give me more happiness in the long run? And so you have to take that into consideration almost. Whereas Mill doesn't do that, and that again links to him being criticising Mill as pig philosophy. Now, bearing in mind, Mill did, Mill was influenced by Bentham, so it's not like he completely crushes his theory and hates it. It's just that he does give some plausible criticisms to Mill's thing. So what do they both agree on? They're both teleological, like I've just explained. They focus on the end goal, whether that end goal be pleasure or happiness. That's where they're distinct, but they do focus on the end goal. They're both relativist. There's no absolute moral rules, but I haven't moved on to it yet, and probably, yeah, I can move forward now anyway. So Mill is comparable to a rule utilitarianism. Well, he's not a rule utilitarianism. He's moving towards a rule utilitarianism, to a rule utilitarian, or like a weak rule utilitarian, because he just said that there are certain rules that we should abide by, like the veracity norm, for example. We should always tell the truth, but it's a weak utilitarianism, a weak form of utilitarianism, a weak form of rule utilitarianism. That's a tongue twister. Because it's not absolute. Like in certain circumstances, it might give the most happiest outcome if you told a white lie. And for that reason, he's not a strong rule utilitarian. Whereas Bentham, he's comparable to more of an act utilitarianism, because they focus more on each action as they come. So I guess he's a lot more relativist than Mill. And I did say that they do agree on relativism, which generally is the case, but Mill does move towards that rule utilitarianism. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it says here Bentham rejects rules, but Mill accepts that norms and values are necessary for promoting social order and protecting the common good. Okay, I don't think I've mentioned the harm principle yet from Mill. Mill basically said that an individual's autonomy should be respected, because he was a libertarian, unless the individual causes harm to another human, or is at risk of causing harm to another human or animal, then legal or social intervention should take place to inhibit that from happening, or like cause or restore justice to the person who is being harmed. That's the only time that the state should really get involved. And this is known as negative liberty, where he says that individuals should have as much autonomy as possible. And that was one of Mill's terms. Okay, so yeah, I can move on to act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism now. I've basically explained this. Like, these are almost like self-explanatory. Act utilitarianism focuses on each situation differently. It's completely relativist. There are no moral rules whatsoever, and for this reason you can pretty much justify any act. Okay, act utilitarianism, you must decide what action will lead to the greatest good in the particular situation. So the fact that you must decide what will lead to the greatest good in any given situation, there's problems in that in itself, because what is good might be subjective. There's a lot of philosophy out there on people trying to define good, and one of the one of the quotes that I remember, which I think might be wrote on the wall over there. Good is like yellow, not like a horse, meaning it's ambiguous and we can't necessarily define it. So yeah, so what is good for one person may not be good for another. What is good for a sadist or a sadistic psychopath, which is violence, murder, rape, isn't necessarily good for a neurotypical person, let's say, who may enjoy going out with friends. So that's going to be good for them. So I guess you can justify that sadism, especially if this group's involved, because remember what I said at the start with the greatest good for the greatest number. If the greatest number is satisfied, then it doesn't matter about the minority. So with act utilitarianism, you can justify torture. You could justify torturing one person for the rest of eternity to stop the whole suffering of humanity. Now, that for me doesn't really make much sense. If that's an innocent person who's being willfully forced to suffer for the rest of eternity, which is essentially outside of time, so forever. I'm trying not to use words which relate to time at all. Then that just doesn't seem fair. Even to stop the suffering of humanity. But that would be justified in this. You can criticise that example though, because it's extremely unrealistic, but that just shows the extent to which you can take this theory. And I'll just do a comparison with Mill on that same example and say, well, Mill put emphasis on the quality of the pleasure over the quantity of pleasure, and he also used the harm principle. So if harm is being caused, then you shouldn't do a certain action, and harm is being caused in that situation, so you should avoid doing that action. Yeah. Okay, so rule utilitarianism. Oh wait. Okay, weak rule utilitarianism. I'll just read out the definition of this. Weak rule utilitarianism states that only certain occasions the rule can be disobeyed if a greater amount of happiness will result. So Mill was more of a weak utilitarianism, which I've clarified a minute ago. So I think I gave an example about that. Like, lying may always be wrong, which is the veracity norm, but there are exceptions. You're allowed to break that rule if a greater good will be achieved, or if it will promote the greatest happiness, and that is debatable. Strong rule utilitarianism is more like Kantian ethics, so it's much more absolute. There are absolute rules and universal norms in nature which should be applied in all situations, and this should maximise happiness. But there is a little bit of leeway with strong rule utilitarianism, but it's nowhere near as I guess you don't have as much autonomy as a weak rule utilitarianism, where it's much more subjective, I guess, and down to your own judgment, and that's even it gets even more liberal when you get to act utilitarianism, which I covered a minute ago. Okay, it's getting pretty long, the video. Okay, I'll just read out these 3 points because this looks interesting. Some people try to resolve the difference between act and fuck, my phone's gonna die. Between act and rule utilitarianism by appealing to levels of rules. For the sophisticated utilitarianism, 3 levels of rules will guide actions. Number 1. On the lowest level is a set of utility maximising general rules that should always be followed unless there is conflict between them. Number 2, then a second order of conflict resolving rules should be consulted. Number 3, at the top of the hierarchy is the reminder rule of act utilitarianism. When no other rule applies, simply do what your best judgment deems to be the act that will maximise the most utility. Oh, those are utilitarian responses, apparently. Oh, wasn't as interesting as I thought, unfortunately. Okay. I don't think I really need to go much further with this. 1, because my phone's gonna die, and 2, because I've been recording for like 20 minutes. But yeah. Okay, so utilitarianism, it goes on to preference utilitarianism, but I don't have enough time to really go into this, but I might just cover it really quickly. Okay, preference utilitarianism is it basically means that instead of focusing on happiness as the highest good or the determination of morality, it's more of a democratic approach, and it looks at choice. What do people want? So it's not necessarily what makes people happy, it's just what people want. So for example, if you go to the cinema with 5 friends, 3 of you want to go see one film, 2 of you want to go see another, you want to stay in your group, then you're going to do what the majority wants because that's the moral thing to do. And this theory is I want to say coined, I don't know, created. Okay, Peter Singer is a preference utilitarian, and Peter Singer is quite a controversial ethicist, and because he has some strange views on abortion and euthanasia and things like that. So I recommend checking him out. But he's good because he puts emphasis on animal rights as well as just looking at people. So it's like I think that's good anyway because of my own values. But yeah, so he creates a theory which protects all sentient beings rather than just being exclusive to humanity. So does that make him a humanist? Probably not. Yeah, so he focuses on animal liberation. Okay, so he does say that happiness is important, but it's what you want, it's what you prefer to do. So it's not necessarily just focusing on happiness, it's what you want. So there isn't necessarily much difference there, but that seems to be the case. And that seems to be it. How long have we got? 4%. I'll go through these keywords, define these, and then that'll be it. There's only like 7 or something. Teleological, focus on the consequences, not the action and motive. That's deontological. Utility means usefulness. Greatest happiness principle, which is essentially the greatest happiness for the greatest number, which Mill derived from a book, I believe. No, Bentham derived from a book, and he took that and formulated utilitarianism around it. I don't know which book, so don't ask me. Hedonist means that pleasure is morally paramount, which means that pleasure is at the pinnacle of moral decision making or any decision making. The Hedonic Calculus is Bentham's scale for measuring pleasure. We can criticise it for being overly scientific or reductionist because it reduces pleasure to a mere number on a chart rather than being something that involves emotions. We can also say it's too robotic for that same reason. Act utilitarianism, which is similar to Bentham's utilitarianism. There are no absolute moral rules, and it's situationalist or relativist, which means it focuses on each situation as something which needs to be analysed independently to derive a moral conclusion. Rule utilitarianism, how long have we got? 3%. Rule utilitarianism, some rules apply when making moral decisions. Weak rule utilitarianism, rules may be broken in some circumstances, like for example if telling a lie will lead to the happiest outcome, then that's okay. But you should follow the veracity norm, which is a term I believe Mill coined for always telling the truth. Strong rule utilitarianism, which is similar to Kantian ethics, and it's basically that you have to follow rules religiously unless the outcome will certainly cause harm. So that links to Mill's harm principle. And preference utilitarianism satisfies the desires of the majority. So it's more of a democratic approach. It's not about necessarily what makes you happy or what makes you feel pleasure, like classical utilitarianism. And that is it. That's the whole of utilitarianism. This is one of my longer videos, but it should be helpful for the people in my philosophy class and anyone else who's studying philosophy at A level. So yeah, if you enjoyed, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you're new, and yeah, bye.